The radio signal died at exactly 14:32 hours on August 9th, 1942, and Arthur Lewis, 24 years old, civilian telegrapher for the New Zealand Post and Telegraph Department, watched through the window as 3 Japanese landing barges cut through the lagoon toward Badio Island, and he had maybe 7 minutes to decide whether to destroy the transmitter and codebooks or attempt one final transmission that would alert Wellington to the invasion, knowing that either choice would leave him stranded 3,000 kilometers from help with 17 other men who had just become prisoners of war. Arthur's hands hovered over the Morse key, the same instrument he had operated for 14 months in the humid confines of a corrugated iron shed that served as Station Victor Tango 7, one of 43 Coastwatcher posts stretched across the Pacific, like a vast invisible net designed to catch Japanese movements before they could strike Allied forces. The key was warm from continuous use, worn smooth by thousands of messages sent in the darkness, while enemy ships passed within visual range, and now it represented the last connection to everything he knew, to the world where his fiancée Alice waited in Wellington with his letters pressed in a book of poetry, to the farm in Canterbury, where his father still believed his son was doing wireless work in the islands, which was technically true, but omitted the part about being utterly alone in enemy territory with no weapons and no extraction plan. He could hear shouting in Japanese now, closer than before, and the distinct metallic sound of rifles being cocked. The other Coastwatcher stationed with him, Private Leonard Manning, 21 years old, from Auckland, stood by the door with a ceremonial pistol that held exactly 6 rounds, the only firearm on the entire island because the New Zealand government had decided that Coastwatchers should be invisible, not combatants, as if invisibility could stop an invasion force. Manning looked at Arthur with eyes that asked the question neither wanted to speak aloud. What do we do when they come through that door? Arthur thought about the promise he had made to Alice at the Wellington railway station on May 3, 1941, when he volunteered for Coastwatcher duty, because the recruitment officer said it was essential work, safe enough, just monitoring radio frequencies from quiet islands. Alice had held both his hands and made him swear on her grandmother's Bible that he would come back, that he would marry her in St. Paul's Cathedral just as they had planned since they were 17, and he could still smell the lavender perfume she wore, could still feel the way her fingers trembled when she placed the silver compass in his palm, and whispered, "So you can always find your way home to me." That compass sat on the transmitter desk now, its needle pointing stubbornly south toward a home that might as well have been on another planet. The invasion had not been a surprise, not really. For 3 weeks, Arthur had been intercepting increasingly urgent Japanese naval communications, reporting every detail to Wellington. Troop movements, supply ship coordinates, the unmistakable pattern of forces converging on the Gilbert Islands. He had sent 47 messages in July alone, each one acknowledged with the same terse response. Message received, continue monitoring, no evacuation authorized. The last phrase had appeared in every communication since June, as if Wellington believed that saying it enough times would somehow make a rescue operation materialize despite the fact that the nearest Allied naval vessel was 2,000 kilometers away, and the Japanese controlled every sea lane in between. What Arthur had not anticipated was how fast it would happen. The Gilbert Islands garrison consisted of exactly 22 New Zealand personnel, 10 soldiers who arrived in May to provide token defense, 7 civilian telegraphers like himself, 3 medical orderlies, 1 supply officer, and 1 commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander James Garvey, who was currently on the neighboring island of Tarawa proper, trying to organize a defense with 10 rifles, 1 machine gun, and a garrison that had trained for observation, not combat. When the lookout spotted the Japanese fleet at dawn, Garvey had sent a runner with orders that were both clear and hopeless. Transmit until contact. Destroy nothing that might anger the enemy. Surrender with dignity. But dignity did not send intelligence. Dignity did not warn the Allied fleet that Japanese forces now controlled a strategic position from which they could strike at supply lines stretching from Pearl Harbor to Australia. And dignity certainly did not help the 6 Coastwatcher stations further south, who were still transmitting, still believing they had time, still unaware that the net was closing. Arthur made his decision. His fingers flew across the Morse key with the speed that came from 4 years at the telegraph school in Wellington, where instructors drilled them until they could send 25 words per minute in their sleep. The message was brief, encoded in the simple substitution cipher that any competent Japanese intelligence officer would break in under an hour, but might buy enough time for the transmission to be received. Victor Tango 7, Enemy Landing Force Batio. Estimate battalion strength, no resistance possible. Additional stations compromised. This station going silent. Tell Alice. He never finished the sentence. The door exploded inward, and 3 Japanese soldiers entered with rifles raised, shouting commands in a language Arthur did not understand but whose meaning was crystalline. Manning dropped the pistol without firing a shot, hands raised, and Arthur carefully removed his headset and placed it on the desk, as if he were simply finishing his shift, as if this were a normal Thursday afternoon, and not the moment his entire world contracted to the dimensions of an iron shed that smelled of rust and fear, and the particular desperation of men who had just realized their government had sent them to die in places no one had ever heard of. The soldier who appeared to be in charge, a sergeant with a face burned dark by the Pacific sun, stepped forward and examined the transmitter with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. He said something in Japanese, and when Arthur did not respond, the sergeant struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle, a casual violence that sent Arthur to his knees with blood filling his mouth and the copper taste of terror on his tongue. Manning started forward, some suicidal instinct to help, and another soldier hit him in the stomach hard enough that Arthur heard ribs crack. They were pulled outside into the blinding afternoon sun, hands bound behind their backs with wire that cut into wrists, and marched down to the beach where the landing force had assembled. Arthur counted approximately 400 Japanese soldiers, which meant this was not just a raid, but a full occupation, which meant every Coastwatcher station in the Gilbert Islands was now compromised, which meant the entire southern flank of the Allied Pacific Intelligence Network had just collapsed in the space of one afternoon. The other Coastwatchers and soldiers had already been rounded up and knelt in the sand. 17 men in various states of shock and injury, overseen by soldiers who held bayoneted rifles with the relaxed grip of men who had done this before in China, in Malaya, in a dozen other places where resistance had proven futile. Lieutenant Commander Garvey knelt at the front, his naval uniform torn and bloodied, and when he saw Arthur and Manning being added to the line, something in his expression broke, just for a second, the face of a commanding officer who had led his men into a trap from which there was no escape, and would spend whatever time remained alive knowing it. Arthur knelt in the sand next to a young private named Thomas Sears, 19 years old from Christchurch, who had arrived at Batio only 6 weeks earlier, and spent most of that time being violently seasick and writing letters to his mother that Arthur helped him compose because Thomas struggled with spelling. Thomas was shaking so hard that Arthur could feel the vibrations through the sand, and when their eyes met, the kid whispered, "Are they going to kill us?" Arthur wanted to lie, wanted to offer some false comfort, but the truth was they both knew that unarmed intelligence personnel captured in enemy territory rarely survived, especially when they had been actively transmitting military intelligence up until the moment of capture. What followed was 3 hours of interrogation, conducted partly through a Japanese officer who spoke broken English, and partly through violence that required no translation. They wanted to know about codes, about other Coastwatcher stations, about Allied ship movements and defensive positions. The interrogator, a thin man with round spectacles who introduced himself as Lieutenant Suzuki, explained in precise, almost apologetic tones that cooperation would result in prisoner of war status and eventual repatriation, while resistance would result in execution as spies and saboteurs. He made it sound reasonable, as if they were discussing contract terms rather than the wholesale dismantling of an intelligence network that had taken 3 years to build. Most of the men said nothing, not out of heroism but simple ignorance. The Coastwatcher system was designed with strict compartmentalization, each station knowing only its own frequency and protocols, unable to compromise the larger network even under torture. Arthur knew more than most because of his training at telegraph school. But what he knew was already obsolete. Codes changed weekly, frequencies rotated, the entire system built on the assumption that any individual station could be captured at any time. But Lieutenant Suzuki was patient and methodical. Over 3 hours he assembled enough fragments from different men, a slip about transmission times here, a mention of call signs there, to construct a rough map of the Coastwatcher network. Arthur watched him work with a sick fascination, understanding that they were witnessing their own intelligence apparatus being dismantled in real time through nothing more than careful questioning and the accumulated micro-failures of exhausted, terrified men trying desperately to say nothing, but betraying themselves with pauses and glances, and the 1,000 tiny tells that separate trained intelligence officers from civilian telegraphers who had volunteered because it sounded like an adventure. When the interrogation finally ended, they were herded to a compound that had once served as a colonial administrative building and now functioned as a makeshift prison, a single large room with concrete floors, no furniture, one window with iron bars and a guard station outside the door. 22 men crowded into a space designed for perhaps 8, and as the tropical night fell with its characteristic suddenness, they sat against walls and whispered about what would happen next. Lieutenant Commander Garvey, who had maintained rigid composure throughout the interrogation, gathered them together and spoke in the kind of hushed, urgent tone that officers use when delivering information they know will not be comforting. Gentlemen, our status is uncertain. We are technically civilian contractors and military observers, which under international law should grant us prisoner protections. However, we have been operating an active intelligence network, which the Japanese may classify as espionage. I am going to make a formal request for prisoner of war status and contact with the Red Cross. Until that is resolved, we maintain discipline, we support each other, and we do not provide any further information under any circumstances. Someone asked the question everyone was thinking, are they going to move us to a proper prisoner camp? Garvey hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and in that pause Arthur understood the terrible truth. There was no prisoner camp. Not here. Not on any of these remote atolls. The Japanese logistical chain was stretched thin across half the Pacific, every ship and supply line committed to pushing further south toward Australia and east toward Hawaii. 22 prisoners represented mouths to feed, space to guard, complications to manage, and military bureaucracies under pressure tended to solve such problems through the simplest means available. Arthur spent the first night sitting against the wall between Private Manning and an older telegrapher named Douglas Mackenzie, 43 years old, who had worked at the Auckland Central Telegraph Office for 20 years before volunteering for Coastwatcher duty because his son had been killed at Crete, and he wanted, in some inarticulate way, to keep fighting. Douglas had a wife and 3 daughters in Auckland, and throughout the night he whispered their names like a prayer or an incantation, as if saying them aloud could somehow keep them real, keep him connected to a world where fathers returned from war and families remained intact. The days that followed established a routine that was both mundane and terrifying in its implications. Each morning they were given rice and water, barely enough to sustain life but sufficient to keep them functional. They were allowed outside for 1 hour in the afternoon, during which time they were put to work digging trenches and reinforcing coastal defenses under the supervision of Korean laborers who spoke neither English nor Japanese and communicated primarily through gestures and the occasional blow with a shovel handle. The work was exhausting in the tropical heat, made worse by inadequate food and the psychological weight of building defenses for an enemy occupation. Arthur tried to mark time by tracking the sun's position and scratching marks on the concrete wall with a stone he palmed during work detail, but the days began to blur together in a haze of heat and hunger, and the constant low-grade fear that today might be the day their status got resolved in the worst possible way. He thought about Alice constantly, obsessively, constructing elaborate fantasies about what she was doing at any given moment, waking at 7 in their small flat in Wellington, walking to her job at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, checking the mail for letters that would never arrive, maybe standing at the window in the evening looking north as if she could somehow sense him 3,000 kilometers away, doing exactly the same thing in reverse. 2 weeks into captivity, something changed. A new Japanese officer arrived, a naval commander whose uniform was too crisp and too clean for frontline duty, suggesting he had come from higher headquarters with specific instructions. Lieutenant Suzuki appeared agitated in his presence, and the guards became noticeably more hostile, refusing to allow the prisoners their afternoon exercise period and reducing the food ration by half. Through the barred window, Arthur watched as the compound was reinforced with additional barbed wire, and the guard rotation increased from 2 men to 6. Private Sears, who had developed a dangerous fever from an infected cut on his leg, began hallucinating at night, calling out for his mother in a high, childish voice that made sleep impossible for anyone in the room. Douglas Mackenzie, using strips torn from his own shirt and hot water the guards grudgingly provided, cleaned the wound as best he could, but without proper antibiotics the infection was spreading, dark red lines climbing up the kid's calf like poison roots. Lieutenant Commander Garvey requested medical attention, was refused, requested again with increasing desperation, and was told that medical supplies were reserved for Japanese personnel. Arthur watched Thomas Sayers die over the course of 4 days, the fever climbing until the kid stopped making sense, stopped recognizing where he was, thrashed against hands trying to comfort him, and finally went still on September 12th at approximately 3 in the morning, his body cooling in the tropical heat while 21 men sat in silence and confronted the reality that they were no longer prisoners awaiting transfer, but inconvenient complications that their captors were allowing to resolve themselves through neglect. They buried Thomas the next morning in a shallow grave dug at the edge of the compound. No marker, no ceremony beyond Lieutenant Commander Garvey reading the 23rd Psalm from memory, while the guards watched with expressions that ranged from bored indifference to what might have been pity. Arthur kept thinking about Thomas's mother in Christchurch, how she was probably setting a place at the dinner table and telling herself he would write soon, unaware that her son was already dead and buried in an unmarked hole on an island she could not find on a map. The death changed something fundamental in the compound. Where before the men had maintained a stubborn discipline, a belief that survival was possible through cooperation and endurance, now a fatalistic resignation settled over them, like the morning mist that rolled in from the lagoon. Conversations grew shorter, more utilitarian. Men stopped talking about home, stopped making plans for when we get out of here, stopped maintaining the small rituals of normalcy that had helped them pretend this was temporary. Arthur found himself returning obsessively to the same memory. The afternoon he proposed to Alice, walking along the beach at Lyle Bay with the wind coming hard off Cook Strait and the sand stinging their faces. He had practiced a speech, something romantic about fate and commitment and building a life together, but when the moment came he simply pulled the ring from his pocket, his grandmother's ring, thin gold with a tiny sapphire that caught the light, and said, "I know this sounds mad, but I think we should get married." And Alice had laughed, that full-throated laugh that was the first thing he had loved about her, and said, "I've been waiting for you to ask since we were 17, you impossible fool," and kissed him with salt spray on her lips, and the whole world narrowing to the space between their heartbeats. He wondered if she still wore the ring, or if after 6 months of silence she had put it away in a drawer and started the slow, painful process of accepting that he was not coming back. He wondered if the final transmission had reached Wellington, if someone in the cipher office had decoded his aborted message and understood that "tell Alice" was not intelligence, but the last desperate reach of a man trying to keep a promise he could no longer keep. In early October, the compound was relocated. The prisoners were marched under guard to a different building on the opposite side of Betio Island, a structure that had formerly served as a mental asylum during the British colonial period, and now functioned as storage for captured equipment. The move was accomplished with brutal efficiency. They were given 5 minutes to gather their few possessions, then force-marched 2 kilometers through the midday heat, while guards prodded anyone who slowed with bayonets. Douglas Mackenzie collapsed halfway, simply stopped walking and sat down in the road. And when the guards began shouting, Arthur and Private Manning each took an arm and carried him the rest of the way. Mackenzie's feet dragging in the dust and his voice repeating, "I can't, I can't, I can't," until the words lost all meaning. The new prison was worse in every measurable way. Smaller, hotter, with walls that radiated heat like an oven, and a corrugated iron roof that turned the interior into a suffocating box where the temperature regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. There was no furniture, no latrine beyond a bucket in the corner, no ventilation beyond the cracks in the walls. The guards delivered food once a day, always at unpredictable times, and the water ration was reduced to 1 canteen per man per 24 hours, barely enough to replace what they lost through sweat. Arthur developed a system for surviving the heat. He soaked his shirt in the morning water ration, wore it wet throughout the day, and tried to remain absolutely motionless during the worst hours between noon and 3 o'clock. Others adopted different strategies. Some stripped to their underwear. Some compulsively drank their entire water ration immediately, then suffered through long, dry hours. Some simply lay on the concrete floor and dissociated into whatever mental space allowed them to endure. On October 14th, American aircraft appeared over Betio for the first time. The sound of their engines was unmistakable, the deep thrumming of bombers flying at high altitude. And through the cracks in the walls, Arthur glimpsed Japanese soldiers running for cover as the first bombs fell on the harbor installations. The attack lasted approximately 12 minutes and accomplished what Arthur suspected was significant damage, based on the secondary explosions that continued for an hour afterward. The prisoners cheered weakly, some reflexive patriotic response to seeing Allied action. But the cheering stopped when one of the guards entered and beat the nearest man with a rifle butt until blood ran down his face, screaming in Japanese that sounded like rage or fear or both. The next day, October 15th, 1942, began like any other day in captivity. Arthur woke at dawn from another dream about Wellington. Another false morning, where he opened his eyes expecting to see Alice beside him, and instead saw the same concrete walls and the same exhausted faces of men who had been prisoners for exactly 67 days. The morning rice ration was delivered late, only half the usual amount, and the guards seemed agitated, speaking in rapid Japanese and frequently glancing at the sky as if expecting another air raid. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, the prisoners were ordered outside and told through gestures to begin working on trench repairs near the compound. They were organized into 3 groups, each supervised by Korean laborers who carried rifles but seemed uncomfortable with their authority. Young men conscripted from occupied territory, who clearly had no desire to be on this island any more than the prisoners did. Arthur's group was sent to reinforce a section of trench that had partially collapsed during the previous day's bombing, backbreaking work in the climbing heat, and he found himself working beside Private Manning, both of them moving with the slow, deliberate efficiency of men conserving energy they did not have. Around 10:30 they heard aircraft again, this time lower and faster, and before the warning sirens could sound, American fighters swept over the island, strafing anything that moved. Arthur threw himself into the trench as bullets stitched the sand around him, that distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds passing overhead, and when he looked up, he saw one of the Korean guards just running in blind panic toward the tree line. And then there was a prisoner running too, someone from one of the other work groups, sprinting for the same tree line as if escape were possible, as if there were anywhere to go on an island 5 kilometers across, surrounded by Japanese forces. The guards opened fire, and Arthur watched as the running prisoner, he thought it might be one of the medical orderlies but could not be sure at this distance, stumbled, kept running, stumbled again, and fell face first into the sand 50 meters from the trees. The Korean guard who had been running was also down, hit by friendly fire or American strafing, the chaos too complete to tell. And then the American aircraft were gone, and there was only smoke and the smell of burning fuel, and a terrible silence broken by someone screaming in pain. The prisoners were immediately rounded up and force-marched back to the compound at bayonet point, the guards shouting and clearly terrified that other prisoners might attempt escape during the confusion. Arthur counted heads as they were pushed back into the building and came up one short, confirming that someone had indeed run and been killed. Lieutenant Commander Garvey tried to speak with the guard commander, tried to explain that it had been panic and confusion, that one man acting foolishly should not reflect on the rest of the group, but the guard commander struck him across the face and ordered everyone inside. They waited in the sweltering heat of the compound for 3 hours, during which time the whispered consensus was that they would face some form of collective punishment, but that execution seemed unlikely. Prisoners were still valuable for labor, still potentially useful for propaganda or prisoner exchange. Arthur sat against the wall next to Douglas Mackenzie, who had been growing progressively weaker, his skin taking on a yellowish cast that suggested liver problems or malnutrition or both, and they did not speak, simply sat in companionable silence and tried not to think about what was coming. At approximately 1400 hours, a Japanese officer entered the compound, the same naval commander who had arrived weeks earlier and whose presence had correlated with the deterioration of their treatment. He was accompanied by Lieutenant Suzuki and 6 guards, and he carried a katana, the traditional Japanese sword, in a lacquered scabbard at his side. Through Lieutenant Suzuki, who translated in a voice that trembled slightly, the commander announced that the prisoner who attempted escape had been shot and killed, and that this act of defiance represented a breach of the surrender terms and a violation of the trust extended to enemy combatants captured in the field. Arthur felt something cold and heavy settle in his stomach as the translation continued. Therefore, in accordance with military justice and the authority vested in this command, sentence of death will be carried out on all captured personnel for the crime of espionage and attempted escape. The words were delivered in that same precise, almost apologetic tone that Lieutenant Suzuki had used during the initial interrogation, as if he were simply announcing a change in the work schedule rather than the execution of 21 men. Lieutenant Commander Garvey stood and began to protest, citing Geneva Convention protections and demanding contact with the International Red Cross. But his voice was drowned out by guards shouting orders, and the prisoners were pulled to their feet and their hands bound with wire behind their backs. Arthur's mind went absolutely blank, a white static of panic and disbelief, because this was not how it was supposed to happen. There were protocols, there were rules. Prisoners were supposed to survive and be repatriated and tell their stories, not executed in makeshift prisons on forgotten islands by officers acting outside any legitimate authority. They were marched outside into the afternoon sun, and Arthur registered details with the strange hyper-clarity that comes during extreme crisis. The way the light reflected off the lagoon, the sound of wind moving through coconut palms, the pattern of shadows on the sand. They were lined up in the compound yard, and the guards formed a loose perimeter, and the naval commander removed his sword from its scabbard with ceremonial precision, the blade catching sunlight like a signal mirror. Private Manning, standing next to Arthur, began to pray aloud. The Lord's Prayer delivered in a voice high and tight with terror, and others joined in until there was a ragged chorus of men reciting words they had learned as children and probably had not spoken since, reaching for any ritual that might impose meaning on what was about to happen. Arthur tried to join them but found he could not remember the words, could not form thoughts into sentences, could only hear the ocean and the wind and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like a countdown clock measuring seconds he had left. The commander stepped forward and spoke in Japanese, some kind of formal proclamation, and Lieutenant Suzuki translated, "By order of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sentences to be carried out immediately for crimes against military order and security of occupation forces." And then the commander approached the first man in the line, Lieutenant Commander Garvey, who stood at attention with his head raised and his eyes open, refusing to look away, and the sword came up and then down in a movement too fast to follow properly, and Garvey's body collapsed in the sand. Arthur closed his eyes. He could not watch, could not bear witness, could only stand with his hands bound and his legs shaking and think about Alice, about the promise he had made, about the letter he would never write, about the wedding that would never happen in St. Paul's Cathedral. He thought about his father on the farm in Canterbury, how he would receive the telegram with the bureaucratic phrasing that would avoid mentioning execution or beheading, just died in service to his country, as if that explained anything, as if that provided any comfort. He heard the sounds of the executions moving down the line, each one marked by a distinct thud, and the rustle of bodies falling, and he counted without meaning to, some automatic function of his mind keeping track. 2, 3, 4, 5. Douglas Mackenzie was next to him, and started saying his daughters' names again. Margaret, Elizabeth, Sarah, like a protective charm, like saying them could somehow keep them safe from this. And then the sound stopped next to Arthur, and he knew without looking that Douglas was dead and he was next. He opened his eyes and saw the commander standing before him, the sword dark now with blood. And in the man's face Arthur saw neither cruelty nor satisfaction, only a kind of exhausted professionalism, someone doing a job they had done before and would do again. And somehow that was worse than hatred would have been. Arthur thought about asking for a moment, thought about asking to face south toward home, but his mouth was too dry and his voice would not work, so he simply looked at the sky, at the clouds building over the lagoon in preparation for afternoon rain, and thought about how strange it was that the world could be so beautiful in the last seconds of his life. The sword came up, and Arthur's final thought was of Alice at the train station with lavender perfume and trembling fingers, and he tried to hold that image, tried to make it the last thing he carried into darkness, but the image was already fading like a photograph left too long in the sun, and then there was no time left, and the sword came down. The massacre was completed in approximately 30 minutes. All 21 prisoners were executed in the compound yard and buried in a mass grave dug by Korean laborers within sight of where they died. The Japanese command filed no report of the executions, made no notification to any international authority, simply erased 21 men from the earth as if they had never existed. In Wellington, in Auckland, in Christchurch and Canterbury, and a dozen other towns across New Zealand, families waited for letters that would never arrive, for official notifications that would be delayed by bureaucratic confusion and the fog of war, for some acknowledgement that their sons and husbands and brothers were alive or dead, or even existed in Japanese custody. Alice Graham waited 14 months for confirmation. The first indication that something was wrong came when Arthur's letters stopped arriving in August 1942. But letters were often delayed or lost, and she told herself to be patient, to keep writing, to maintain faith. By Christmas, she had written 43 letters to an address that no longer existed, each one returned marked undeliverable, or simply vanishing into the postal system with no acknowledgement. In January 1943, she contacted the Defense Department and was told that Arthur's status was missing, presumed captured, which was simultaneously hopeful and devastating, because captured meant alive, but also meant prison camps and uncertainty, and the terrible waiting. The truth emerged slowly, pieced together from multiple sources. In November 1943, a Japanese prisoner captured in the Marshall Islands mentioned Coastwatcher executions in the Gilbert Islands during interrogation. In February 1944, Australian Coastwatchers who retook Tarawa after the massive American amphibious assault found the mass grave and evidence of the massacre, along with personal effects that could be traced to the missing New Zealand personnel. In May 1944, nearly 2 years after the executions, Alice received the official telegram. Regret to inform you that Arthur David Lewis, civilian telegrapher, died while in enemy custody on October 15, 1942. Details remain under investigation. His service and sacrifice will be remembered. The telegram included no mention of execution, no mention of the circumstances, no mention that he and 20 others had been murdered in violation of every principle of warfare and human decency. Those details would emerge over the following months through war crimes investigations, witness testimony, and the slow reconstruction of what had happened in the compound on Badio. The Japanese commander who ordered and carried out the executions, Captain Masanori Shibuya, was convicted of war crimes in 1946 and executed by hanging in Tokyo, though that justice came far too late for the families who had already lived through years of not knowing. Alice never married. She kept the letters Arthur had sent from the Gilbert Islands, kept the silver compass she had given him, though it had never been recovered, kept his photograph on her dresser, and fresh flowers next to it every week until she died in 1988, at the age of 70. On October 15th each year, she would take the train to St. Paul's Cathedral in Wellington and sit alone in the back pew for exactly 1 hour, marking the anniversary of a wedding that never happened and a promise that was kept in every way, except the one that mattered. The Coastwatcher Memorial in Betio was erected in 1992, 50 years after the massacre. A simple stone marker listing 21 names in alphabetical order with the inscription, "They remained at their posts until the end, regardless of their own safety, providing intelligence vital to Allied operations in the Pacific. Their sacrifice enabled the victories that followed." The memorial stands approximately 100 meters from where they were executed, overlooking the lagoon where Japanese barges first appeared on that August morning, and it is visited occasionally by historians and veterans, but mostly forgotten by a world that has moved on to newer conflicts and more recent tragedies. The Coastwatcher network itself continued operating throughout the war, expanding to include over 400 stations across the Pacific. The intelligence they provided proved crucial in dozens of battles, most famously, the advance warning of Japanese aircraft movements that allowed American forces to intercept Admiral Yamamoto's flight in April 1943, killing the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. The men who operated those stations, mostly civilians, mostly unarmed, mostly alone, remained at their posts knowing what had happened at Tarawa, knowing that capture meant almost certain death, and they transmitted until the last possible second before destroying their equipment and attempting to evade. After the war, the New Zealand government conducted extensive investigations into the Coastwatcher program and the Tarawa massacre specifically. The investigations concluded that the men had been placed in untenable positions, without adequate protection or extraction plans, essentially abandoned in forward positions with no realistic hope of rescue once Japanese forces advanced. The Defense Department issued formal apologies to the families in 1951, along with posthumous commendations and small financial settlements that no one wanted, but everyone accepted because refusing them would have suggested that money could somehow compensate for sons and husbands and brothers murdered while serving their country. Douglas Mackenzie's wife received his telegraphist's certificate, framed and mounted with a small brass plaque, identifying him as a dedicated servant of New Zealand who died in the performance of his duty. His 3 daughters grew up with that certificate on the living room wall, grew up knowing their father had been killed in the war, but not knowing until they were adults that he had been executed, not killed in combat, executed in a compound yard by an officer with a sword, while begging for his life by reciting his daughters' names. The youngest daughter, Sarah, became a nurse like Alice Graham and spent 30 years working with veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress, driven by some need to heal wounds her father had carried, even if she could not heal her own. Private Leonard Manning's family in Auckland never fully recovered. His mother refused to accept the official notification, insisted for years that Leonard was alive in a prison camp somewhere and would eventually be repatriated, wrote letters to the Defense Department and the Red Cross, and anyone who might listen demanding they continue searching. She died in 1953 still believing her son would come home, and Manning's father followed 6 months later, the family doctor listing heart failure on the death certificate, but everyone knowing it was grief that killed him, the slow accumulation of loss that finally exceeded his ability to endure. The full details of the massacre were not publicly released until 1968, when the government declassified war crimes tribunal testimony and investigative reports under the 30-year rule. The revelation sparked brief public outrage and renewed calls for recognition of Coastwatcher contributions. But by then the war had been over for more than 2 decades, and public attention was focused on Vietnam and social change and the future rather than the past. A documentary was produced by the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation in 1972, 30 years after the massacre, featuring interviews with surviving Coastwatchers and family members of those killed, but it aired late at night and reached a limited audience. Today, Arthur Lewis exists primarily as a name on a memorial, a line in military records, a footnote in histories of Pacific intelligence operations. There is no statue, no school named in his honor, no popular awareness of who he was or what he endured. The telegraph equipment he operated was destroyed in 1942. His personal effects were lost or looted, and the only physical trace of his existence is the grave marker in Betio and a small box of letters in the National Archives that researchers occasionally request when studying Coastwatcher operations. But in Wellington, in the archives of St. Paul's Cathedral, there is a record that most people never see. A wedding reservation made in April 1941 for Arthur David Lewis and Alice Margaret Graham, scheduled for November 23, 1942 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The reservation was never canceled, and for years afterward the church secretary would note on November 23 that the 2 o'clock slot was reserved for Lewis Graham wedding, a bureaucratic ghost of a ceremony that never happened. The notation finally disappeared in the 1960s during a records reorganization, but for 20 years it remained, a small and stubborn insistence that Arthur and Alice's promise mattered, that their story deserved to be remembered even when history had moved on. The Coastwatcher motto, adopted after the war and inscribed on memorials across the Pacific, consists of 3 words: "The Watchers remained." It is both statement of fact and tribute, acknowledgement that these men stayed at their posts when every survival instinct screamed to run, that they continued transmitting when capture was certain, that they fulfilled their duty knowing the cost would almost certainly be their lives. Arthur Lewis remained until 14:32 hours on August 9, 1942, transmitting intelligence until Japanese soldiers broke down his door, and that remaining, that stubborn, terrified, utterly human decision to do the job despite everything, represents a kind of courage that does not make headlines or win medals, but defines what it means to serve. In the end, courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Arthur Lewis was terrified every single day of his 14 months on Betio, terrified of Japanese invasion, terrified of capture, terrified that he would never see Alice again, terrified that his death would be meaningless and forgotten. And yet he stayed. He transmitted. He fulfilled the promise he made to his government and his country, even as it became clear that the government and country would not fulfill their promise to him. And on the last day of his life, bound and awaiting execution in a compound yard, he did not beg or plead or compromise his dignity. He simply thought about the woman he loved and the life they would never build together, and faced what came with as much grace as any human being could manage in that impossible moment. If that is not heroism, then the word has no meaning. And if we forget these men, forget their names and their stories and the price they paid, then we dishonor not just their memory, but the very idea that sacrifice matters, that duty means something, that promises, even promises broken by death and distance, still carry weight in a world that often seems determined to forget. 21 men died in a compound yard on Betio on October 15, 1942. They died far from home, in a place most people cannot find on a map, killed by an enemy that violated every rule of warfare, and they died knowing that their families would not learn the truth for years, that their service would be classified and hidden, and slowly erased by time and bureaucracy. But they remained at their posts. They transmitted until the end, and the intelligence they provided saved lives, shortened the war, and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in the Pacific. Arthur Lewis kept his promise to Alice in the only way he could. He tried to come home. He fought to survive. And when survival was no longer possible, he carried her memory into darkness as the last and most precious thing he possessed. That is all any of us can do when faced with the impossible. Hold tight to what we love, do our duty as best we can, and trust that somewhere, somehow, the people we leave behind will remember us not for how we died, but for how we tried to live. The Watchers remained. And because they remained, we are here to tell their story. If you found this story meaningful, if it reminded you that history is not just dates and battles but individual human beings making impossible choices, please share it. These men deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve to know that their loss mattered. And we, who live in the world their sacrifice helped create, owe them at least the dignity of speaking their names and acknowledging what they endured. Like, subscribe, and share this video so that Arthur Lewis, Douglas Mackenzie, Leonard Manning, Thomas Sears, and their 17 brothers in arms are not just names on a memorial, but real people whose courage and sacrifice continue to echo across the decades. The Watchers remained. We must ensure they are not forgotten.